The Eternal Castle is a game that hits you with Ludo Kino before you even buy it. Hearing or reading about it causes you to interact with the kayfabe immediately, like some sort of cognito hazard. It's a remaster of a game that never existed. Debates still rage on whether or not a real 80s Eternal Castle game even existed. People exploit others' desire for the source game to spread pranks or suspicious archives, and even now, 5 years later, people still get butthurt about a game that commits to the bit. See, it's plausible to believe because media becomes lost all the time. There's a very popular campaign currently going on about exactly that. A game from my childhood called Deimos Rising is close to being at that point. Cracked copies still float around, sure, but I've yet to find anyone who's figured out how to retain a working save and unlock levels properly on modern Windows. Many people have half-remembered games, books, movies, and songs from their youth. Fragmented memories that drift in our brains until something triggers them. I experienced this myself recently when I rediscovered the Apogee puzzle action game Mystic Towers. However, I grew up playing the things Eternal Castle was inspired by, all of which came out after the original TEC ostensibly did, so I saw the fiction of it immediately. But I respected it, and I took it as a sign of the passion the team clearly has for this particular era in video games. The Eternal Castle plays on these two forms of unreality. The unreality of fragmented memory, and the unreality of when something is truly lost and forgotten. What little explicit story exists in Eternal Castle is about a ruined Earth, never to be reclaimed, given up as lost, and the fragmented unreality of discerning dreams from waking and forgetting alternate realities of failure even existed. The two biggest hurdles to anyone playing Eternal Castle are its controls and its aesthetic. Some parts are visually difficult, like the text wall that provides backstory, or the strobing nightclub hallway. Other parts are beautiful, like how changing lights can smoothly illuminate pixel art, or how a door closing can alter your perspective on a scene. Its controls are very simple in terms of the number of buttons, but allow very complex actions to be carried out fairly intuitively. Although this comes at the cost of often having to fight the controls, or a feeling like the timing of actions is inconsistent, which is very bad in a game with so much platforming and combat. What I want to focus on today is how these controls work together with the events of the story. The fact such a relatively simple control scheme can facilitate a bunch of playstyles. Eternal Castle opens on the aforementioned horrible to read exposition screen, but follows it up with an amazingly animated character select screen, and an intro cutscene that immediately solidified in my mind that this game was going to be an art. The first level is one of those nearly perfect video game levels. After the crash, we awaken in a tree, and the first task is figuring out how to get down. If you're a spectacularly useless person with very little urge to experiment, the game will eventually pop up control tutorials. The very first screen where we gain control hides a secret, and secret hunting is critical in Eternal Castle. Do some parkour, learn to attack, and to aim a weapon. Find out that often, running is easier than combat. See a very dynamically lit scene, and get used to discerning details within pixel art gloom. Interact with the environment. Find a collectible in case you hadn't yet. Experience a boss fight, which are kinda rare in this game. Collect the first of 4 MacGuffins, and be reminded of our mission. It is our freedom to pursue the 3 remaining fragments of our glider in whatever order we choose. Permanent character upgrades are present in each level, so the order you pick can notably change how things play out and what you're going to have trouble with. Generally, I like to go with Unholy Church first. Unholy Church begins with a stealth section through blackened smog and cold rain. To be clear, stealth is not a requirement. It's totally possible to sprint along the path, and I imagine bringing firearms and gun upgrades from other levels allows you to just shoot through the mutants throughout the section. Like Abe's Odyssey, we move from cover to cover, concealing ourselves from the monsters, and eventually flee from hounds. All of this was done with a handful of buttons and no tutorializing or floating prompts. In fact, the "what a terrible night to have a curse pop up" is the only one like it in the game. We enter the church proper, evade a huge beast, notice code symbols on the back wall and use them to open a big lock, which drops us into mutative fluid. We have a character swap moment with an added gimmick that our left and right controls reverse whenever the color palette changes. After getting cured of our mutation, there's a short sort of parkour section, which controls as smoothly or awkwardly as your personal skill level allows you to pull off. Another short set piece with a sort of wire hacking minigame and more fantastic music. Up the elevator, one last meditation respawn point for the level, and one last journal entry. Unholy Church's backstory is the most explicit of the level's stories, and it gives us a peek into the mind of the level's boss. same 4 directions and 3 buttons that until now have let us platform, sneak and hide, control a monster, and hack a panel, are now being used for an honestly kinda challenging fight. The other levels in Eternal Castle don't quite have this amount of variety in gameplay. Ancient Ruins focuses mostly on melee combat and long platforming sequences. The Forgotten City, in contrast, is a war zone where ranged combat with firearms and trying to move quickly from cover to cover is the norm, but they impose other challenges on you instead. Ancient Ruins is largely a test of your ability to ration stamina. There's a lot of melee combat in this level, and during the section where level geometry is randomized each run, whether you choose to fight or flee, that bar will empty out a lot if you're not nursing it along. The latter section slows down, and the Abe's Odyssey comparison peeks its head in again, requiring thoughtful platforming through a temple full of traps. This section is what I consider the weakest in Eternal Castle. It wants precise platforming out of the player, but the controls can be unreliable. It doesn't help there's a bit of bugginess about geometry collision. This part in the Forgotten City where I phase through a ladder and a wall is just one example of many. In fact, I've seen people talk about the achievement for speedrunning the intro in less than 20 moments, and it seems to rely on wall clipping. So the developers clearly knew this happened regularly, which isn't a good look when the game wants you to do at least one no-death run. At the end of all this, the last scene of the level is a cathartic mosh pit against a cult leader who calls himself a god.
To deserve this, I'm guilty, accepted, I'm living with curses. I'm stealing and begging, my soul needing purging. Resurfaced, I'm back on the throne with a purpose. And God only knows it's the loneliest road when you're out on your own and there's no one to hold. Tell me who gives a fuck, no you can't let it show, cause the world doesn't care for the man all alone. What you gonna do when the big bad wolf comes knocking at your door? How down that? Didn't even care for my life, now I'm right back home on the family patch. Pour my torch as I walk down a long dark winding path. What you really know about losing everything that you have and then making it back?
It's a good battle where he calls in his cult members to help him if you don't interrupt his chanting, and after you beat him, it feels really fucking good slapping around the survivors as they all rush in. In my opinion, the only other mandatory moment of melee combat that feels this good in the game is the nightclub scene from earlier in the same level. Forgotten City again uses the same old controls we've had the whole time, but now you discover functions like leaning extra deeply into cover, firing over cover, and the ability to pick up and throw rocks has been adapted into throwing grenades. It also presents a couple of mechanics not tied directly to controls, like the friendly NPCs through a large portion of the level, or the sewer sections that have nearly no light in them. There's another sort of quick dashy mobility section as with the other levels, but this time with a sniper tracking you through a scope and enemies with assault rifles trying to impede your progress. It finishes with a dramatic rooftop chase sequence and a spectacular death. With all the glider fragments secured, our glider has the power needed to fly us to the Eternal Castle itself. A slog through a field of binary scourge, dodging some exploding spiders, and a very simple boss fight against a mech. Finally, we stand before the AI we were sent here to save, and we plug in. You might not immediately jump to punching a digital construct, but that's how we roll around here. Each time we slap her, she enters a brief KO'd state, and we hack into her. Each successful hack gets closer to stabilizing her and changes the backdrop of the fight. With the AI stabilized, she finishes her job powering up the ecosystem facilities around the Earth, allowing people to once again live in orbit of the world. Then, on its own, the game reboots. We are now awake. Welcome to reality, such as it is. On a second run, all of your character upgrades are still equipped, and the tiny glider fragments are still collected. Some levels are slightly changed to facilitate this second run, such as the mutated section of the Unholy Church being missing, going straight into the drop at the bottom, and into the turret hallway that ends in a hacking moment. Dying will delete this save file, and open up a new mode called Lost Tales, but ironically, the big problem though is those same old controls we've been using this whole time. As many things as they allow us to do, as many gameplay styles as they create for the pacing of the story of the gameplay, the Ludo Kino if you will, sometimes they just betray the player. Almost every time I've done a second run, I have died because my character refused to stop for a ledge. Or did stop, but then teleported off for no reason. Or decided to execute a running leap on the exact frame I pressed the jump key, rather than half a second after pressing the key like it usually does. These controls also cause combat to sometimes be a mess. I can do a crouching low kick at someone's knees, but then my character can just refuse to stand up unless I disengage from the fight and manually stand. Sometimes I can instantly dodge roll. Sometimes it has to wait half a second, like with jumping. You can dodge the surprise attack from the scientist's wife if you time it perfectly, if the game decides it wants to interpret it perfectly. Hell, these most recent playthroughs are the first time I ever found out that blocking was a thing in Eternal Castle's combat, because it requires attacking and then pressing the up key, which most of the time just breaks combat and hops on the spot. The Eternal Castle is a masterclass in how a simple control scheme can be used to do so much, to provide functions you might never think of, and have the gameplay feel at one with the story as it unfolds. But it can also be a warning of what happens when your controls are not quite polished enough, when animation blending is inconsistent, or when the window for registering inputs feels like RNG. As frustrating as it can be to play, the Eternal Castle is an impassioned art project. It generally goes for what I'm guessing is the equivalent of about $5 US. The story is simple, the controls are basic, but the journey itself is a treasure. If the aesthetic hasn't left you epileptically foaming at the mouth on the floor, and if you're one of those people who enjoy video games as art, the Eternal Castle is a thing worth playing to the end at least once. And with its short runtime, you probably won't play just once. I have been Ash the Conjurer, your Ludo Kino sommelier for the evening. And if you'll excuse me, I have an appointment with the Tea Master.